Oh, good afternoon. Thank you, Victoria, for that kind introduction and for having me here to talk with you today about seeing, or rather, more often, not seeing the trees, and the related question of what good is art history in our current era of catastrophic climate change? Change that is, as has been discussed on the global stage at COP28 in Dubai over the past couple of weeks, now critically altering the environments on which we depend and affecting the physical and mental health of millions across the globe. Now, I know this is supposed to be the festive event in the JASA calendar, but please, before you log off, my intention today is to offer up some sources of hope, by which I mean the sort of hope that may be fuel for action against climate despair through connections and capacities that are already available to us, that we already care about, and that will proliferate in the sharing over time, space, and interspecies boundaries. These capacities include attention, imagination, perception, and languages, both visual and verbal. Attention and imagination in particular, or rather lack of them, have often been cited as obstacles to human thinking, rethinking, and reimagining our world and ways of being, as we fail to grasp a problem that has been diagnosed as too big for human understanding. Art history, despite being a fundamentally transdisciplinary enterprise, may not seem like an obvious candidate in our search for solutions. Yet at its heart, it provides pathways to seeing differently, more attentively, and offers the potential to experience and practice connection in meaningful, impactful, and often joyful ways that in turn enable us to act from a position of possibility rather than retreat in defeat. So let us begin with attention. This is a close view of an intensely observed, intensely worked object. From this distance, we are overwhelmed by the dense lines that threaten to throw our visual perceptions into the realm of migraine aura. If we step out, things begin to become into focus, and we can differentiate a little better. The concentric undulations begin to resolve into a more legible image. And if we step right out, we can recognize that this is a drawing of a cut log. And these are the growth rings of a tree, one for each year of its life, rippling outwards from the central heartwood into the sapwood, through which the water and minerals are carried from the roots of the tree to the rest of the organism. This is a work by Ruth Asawa, which is currently on show at the Whitney Museum, which absolutely stopped me in my tracks when I saw it. Not for any overt visual drama, although that certainly is here, but for the drama of the intense attention that it represents and communicates. This is an extraordinary way of seeing that Asawa has shared here, with so much time, both tree time and drawing time, compacted into this quiet, modestly sized work. What you see here is this extraordinary concentrated attention. You can't see the log, the tree, until you step back, and you must step back even further to conceive of the proverbial wood. Asawa seems to speak to the binding dynamic that in order to really see the wood, one must first really see the trees. But focusing attention on one leaves the other out of view. It's a work that teaches seeing. Now for imagination, this is a work by Whistler titled Nocturne, Blue and Gold, Old Battersea Bridge. It's lyrical and misty, calling up the vision that still seems to leap almost automatically to mind, like a shared reflex when the word London is mentioned, namely fog. Never mind that such fogs are largely a thing of the past, or that a visit to London today is just as likely to sharpen your senses for where air conditioning is or is not to be found. Here is what Oscar Wilde had to say on the matter. Where, if not from the Impressionists, do we get those wonderful brown fogs that come creeping down our streets, blurring the gas lamps and changing the houses into monstrous shadows? To whom, if not to them and their master, do we owe the lovely silver mists that brood over our river and turn to faint forms of fading grace, curved bridge and swaying barge? The extraordinary change that has taken place in the climate of London during the last 10 years is entirely due to a particular school of art. At present, people see fogs not because they are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. There may have been fogs for centuries in London. I dare say there were, but no one saw them, and so we know nothing about them. They did not exist until art invented them. Now it must be admitted that fogs are carried to excess. So Wilde's own excessive point is that without visual articulation, we may look, but we do not see. That the vision of the Impressionists, in this case, has conditioned our own attention and perception. He points to the power of images, both visual and verbal, to change our shared and interconnected imaginations, and therefore to the power of our attention to them to change mindset, narrative, and ultimately action. It's interesting to us, with a shared interest in Japanese art, that it was Japanese visualizations that so provoked the Impressionists into action. But what about the things we don't see? We may remark on trees when they are overtly doing remarkable things, like this, extravagantly blossoming. And in the case of Japan, we are somewhat used to reverence for great trees, giant trees, like this sacred camphor tree or kusunoki in Kyushu. Or, at the other extreme, the venerable miniature bonsai, sometimes hundreds of years old. But when it comes to plants and other non-human beings, there are many hidden things, invisible things that we cannot physically see or are not attuned to perceive. Many of us also suffer from plant blindness, a term that was coined some 20 years ago that indicates an inability to notice or recognize plants in our everyday lives. Plants and trees are all around us, even in cities, so familiar that we barely notice them. But trees are also mysteriously and quietly doing remarkable, essential things, many of which we have little understanding of. Landscape architect Rosetta Elkins has recently said in her book on afforestation, or the practice of tree planting, that we have reached the stage where today, knowing the name of a tree is a radical act. We come face to face with this lack when we can't name trees or plants or animals depicted in paintings, when we are reduced to calling them tree or flower or bird instead of cypress or camellia or egret, for example. When we attach insufficient language to them, that language obscures their full presence, diminishes their vitality, and rather than opening to encounter. This is language that doesn't access, but rather simply fills and obscures. It mistreats and it dulls interpretation of the world and of ourselves. Native American botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer illustrated this point in the positive when she translated the amazing Potawatomi word pupui as the force that causes mushrooms to push up through the earth overnight. To her, the existence of this word was proof that the makers of this word understood a world full of being, full of unseeing energies that animate everything. But during the pandemic, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to look differently at Japanese paintings of plants with colleagues in botany and ecology at Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, in work that some of you may remember from online sessions or tree mobs that we streamed on Zoom from the landscape of the Arboretum and the virtual Harvard Art Museums simultaneously. With my colleagues, Dr. Michael Dosman, Keeper of the Living Collections, and Professor Ned Friedman, Director of the Arboretum, we each brought our different lenses for looking at paintings of woody plants together. And in that interarborated connection, our perceptions were changed in ways that surprised us all. In one session, we looked together at this fan painting featuring two large flowers with opaque lobed petals that I had identified as a magnolia. Now, although generously painted, malachite green leaves convey a sense of the slightly leathery leaves of the plant itself, they are not botanically descriptive in style. However, as soon as Michael saw this fan, he excitedly identified the plant as Magnolia sieboldii, thanks to the rather distinctive protrusion in the center of the flowers. Ned, a professor of evolutionary biology, is amazingly enough a magnolia specialist. And so when we looked together, he botanically unpacked the painting even further. He saw immediately that the fan recorded two phases of fertility distinctive to this particular magnolia. On day one of flowering, the blooms are oriented downwards like the flower on the left, with their tepals slightly open. This is the phase in which the female parts are receptive to pollination by insects. On day two, the flower instead opens upwards like the flower on the right, and the male parts, which is the sort of pinkish collar around the center of the flower, are receptive. This action, which prevents self-pollination, has been carefully depicted here in this fan painting, yet remained unseen until viewed by these botanists. What is more, a folding fan opens left to right, so the flowers have been arranged in chronological order too. The painter, Suzuki Kitsu, is a Rimpa painter, a mode of painting that is celebrated for its luxuriously polychromed and designed works, many of which feature flowering plants. But close botanical looking revealed a level of attention that art historians alone had not fully seen until now, marking a significant shift in the art historical perception of Rimpa painting. In another session, we looked together at Ito Jakuchu's painting Old Pine. Now, art historically speaking, this dynamic painting is readily identifiable as this major member of the ink painting repertoire associated with longevity and the personification of the scholarly gentleman. And again, having identified it as a pine, my art historical duty felt largely fulfilled. Now, the painting is remarkable for the extreme proximity from which the tree is viewed. Compositionally, the eye follows the energetic skyward reaching of this bottom limb here. It goes up beyond the picture plane and up and around, and then it re-enters the painting, and we follow down this attenuated branch all the way around here until we end up almost at the beginning where we started. You are so close, in fact, the composition sort of enfolds you in the embrace of the tree, delivering the subjective experience of being taken into the essence of the pine. The bark is depicted in scale-like plates, and we have this white gash in the center here, which is an exposed inner layer, perhaps damaged wood with slightly calloused tissue growing around it, which forms this dramatic white arc. It feels to me as though it's somehow lithe, traveling at speed, and putting me in mind of a glimpse of a swiftly moving scaled creature, a dragon's body, for example, like this rain dragon, also by Jakuchu. The painted pine is notably adorned with many small dots of ink. I had read these in the vernacular of ink painting as moss dots, indicators of lichen or moss epiphytes growing on the tree. So that's what I was seeing, an ink pine. However, when Ned and Michael saw the painting, they saw something else. They saw a black pine, or Pinus thunbergii to be more specific. Pinus thunbergii is known for its angular growth and plate-like bark and for the persistent bracts that appear when paired needles drop after roughly 3 to 4 years, leaving scale-like protrusions behind. What I had been reading as moss dots, they recognized as the observation of these bracts, which can persist for up to 2 years after the needles drop, and which are one of the identifying features of the black pine, or kuromatsu, as opposed to the red pine, or akamatsu. It took the eyes of these botanists to see what Jakuchu had observed. Now, art historically speaking, we are pretty used to the idea of Jakuchu as a keen observer of nature, a characteristic mostly associated with his magically hyperreal polychrome paintings that display ferocious observation and recapitulation of natural phenomena. In fact, they often convey composites of living beings, like this chicken, which, despite the stylistic assertion of truth to nature, does not in fact exist there. It has the stance of a giant Southeast Asian chameau chicken, combined with the abundant tail of a mainland bird. Ned and Michael's looking revealed that Jakuchu was bringing the same observational powers to bear in his monochrome ink painting as in his polychrome work, challenging our conventional perceptions of the genre and encouraging us to look again at Edo ink painting in general with a new set of questions, a new awareness in hand. We also looked together at this well-known sculpture of Prince Shotoku at age 2 at the Harvard Art Museums with Stephen Schneider of the Arboretum, who was able to share his knowledge of Japanese hinoki cypress, the wood from which the sculpture is carved. We had been studying Prince Shotoku for at least 5 years at that point, and thanks to the evidence of the objects that had been placed inside the hollow sculpture, it had always been dated to about the year 1292. Making it around 700 years old. Thanks to Stephen's insight, we now know that the tree from which he was carved must have been at least 500 years old when it was felled. And it's now difficult to return to that 1292 date without a stinging consciousness of just how anthropocentric the convention of dating a sculpture to the point when human intervention began really is. Stephen's insights decentered our anthropocentric orientation vis-a-vis a quote-unquote museum object and recast him as an even more thoroughly networked sculpture than we had previously understood. Stephen's expertise in reading tree ring patterns, in tandem with the expertise of our conservator, Angela Chung, also led to overturning received wisdom on the construction method of the sculpture, which is hewn not in the round from a single log, as we had previously believed, but rather from 2 planks cut from the log and then bundled together. This was another surprise, immediately connecting us more intimately with both the material and the sculptor. These different collaborative looking experiences produced different results, but all shared a similar excitement and exhilaration, I would say, in those amazing moments where our different modes of vision connected and produced something new and unexpected, something intensely generative in that exchange, which we were then able to share with a much wider network, enthusiastically connected via Zoom during the course of the pandemic. So I've talked about the importance of collaborative, connected looking and of language for trees, for their names and for their parts. And we now know, thanks to the work of scientists such as Suzanne Simard, that trees have their own language, that they talk to each other through the massive subterranean mycorrhizal fungal web that connects roots to roots so that they can share nutrients and distress signals with each other, the so-called wood-wide web of interconnectedness, of mycorrhizal mutualism. This is a visualization by Simard of the network that interconnects a stand of Douglas fir trees, where the large nodes of the trees and the lines connecting them the fungal web of communicative relationships. Simard, by the way, was considered an eccentric outlier for years and ignored until she could bring proof legible in the language of hard science to bear on her findings which are now beginning to transform our approach to intensely extractive forestry practices. The need, at some level at least, to understand the language of trees in this current moment is critical to the future of life on Earth. Artist-activist Katie Halton has reflected this need to make the language beyond the human legible in her tree alphabets, where she substitutes a botanically representative portrait of a tree for each letter of the alphabet. So in the English language, she has pine for P or a redwood for R, for example. And then she translates text into the alphabet of trees so that we get something that looks like this. This is, in a sense, a new language for us. But we also have available to us a very old shared language that can guide us here, namely poetry. Classical Japanese poetry nurtures its own web of interconnectivity over time and space as new poems respond to established precedents in a language that is governed by a shared rhetoric that may seem in many ways restrictive, but in fact performs the function of shared attention and evolutionary memory that can expand dendritically over vast reaches of time. As many of you know, a strict distinction is made in Japanese poetry between the essential implications of a poem, or the hon-i, and the actual emotive impact, or the jo. Poetic interpretation is not a matter of freewheeling individual choice or of the individual imagination as we might think of it today, but rather of accessing shared conventional associations called up with set words and images. One example of this is the word dusk or yugure, and especially the phrase autumn dusk, aki no yugure, which is always associated with the emotion of forlornness, an imagistic mechanism which animates this screen painting by Hasegawa Tohaku of a grove of autumnal trees. Now, if we take a closer look, we can see it's an image of a misty grove of trees which rise up from the very front of the folding screen. And the trees closest to us are most clearly articulated. They're distinctive forking branches with feathery needles growing upwards and outwards like the barbs of a feather from the central trunk. Their distinctive arrow-straight shape indicates that these are hinoki cypress trees. And in between are some withered trees that have lost their needles, adding to the sense of impending wintry decay. The trees around the base, the trees recede around the base of the mountain to the left here. And they curve away into misty infinity behind. The mountain is rendered in relief, suggesting snow. And tucked behind it, in the fifth panel, just here, almost invisible, in fact, is the tip of a pagoda roof, indicating the presence of a remote temple. The entire scene is monochrome, painted in varying shades of diffuse ink that aptly conveys the chilly atmosphere and prepares the ground for the inscription of a poem by the renowned calligrapher Konoe Nobutada, the outsized characters of which drift in the sky above the landscape. The top right and the flank of the mountain are touched with gold, providing luminous ground for the poetic image. The poem by Sosei Hoshi is recorded in the imperial anthology, the Shinkokin Wakashu, which dates to around 1210, and it can be translated, "Having passed over Mount Hasuse at dusk, I look for the night's lodging. Autumn wind whistles through the cypress grove at Miwa." Now, the poem paints a picture of a traveler who has passed over Mount Hatsuse. Today we say Mount Hase, the location of Hasedera Temple, which is home to the well-known miraculous 11-headed Kannon sculpture. And having done so, he seeks a night's lodging, possibly at the temple itself. As our traveler pauses at dusk, the autumn wind stirs the cypress trees of the famous stand at nearby Miwa. Together, Mount Hase, Hasedera Temple, and the Miwa Cypress Grove form a conventionalized meisho, or famous place, with its own set of poetic connotations. Here in the autumnal dusk, with the wind blowing through the ethereal cypress trees, the moment captures the essence of forlornness. This capture and communication of the sentiment of human being in the world in prescriptive poetic language holds and distills this attention in shared language that makes it imaginatively accessible to others, in its own time in the Heian period, but also to all the generations that ingest the poetic canon and continue to evolve its literal and figurative language over time. Evidence of the ability of such works to act as common grounding for communication is clear in this screen, for the inscribed poem does not, in fact, include the key word here, the Miwa Cypress Grove, or Miwa no Hinohara. This is not inscribed on the screen, but the space where it should be is instead left open and occupied by the painted cypress trees. The painted trees proxy for the written trees and both triangulate with the real and imagined trees, whose autumnal essence is embodied in the work, sustaining emotive memory and vision over time, much as Oscar Wilde described the work of the Impressionists on London's fogs. As the poem fashions images out of words, here the painting reciprocates, fashioning the missing words pictorially. Now, this screen is a monochrome work, which is chromatically appropriate to autumnal forlornness. But autumn is, of course, also poetically associated with color, with the turning of the leaves, that process of senescence in which photosynthesis breaks down and the remaining chemicals reveal a range of colors from soft browns to brilliant yellows and reds, depending on the species and climatic conditions. Brilliant colors are associated with autumn in the earliest classical poetry anthologies, while autumn dusk is a backdrop indicative of subtle wistfulness rather than a topic in its own right. This changes in the Heian to Kamakura periods when yugure, or dusk, is given the status of a classificatory topic in its own right, taking center stage, and marking a new step in the evolution of poetic rhetoric. In line with medieval aesthetics of Buddhist-inflected impermanence, autumn dusk is specifically associated with a lack of any specific trigger color. Rather, the prescribed emotive responses to autumn dusk of melancholy and desolation are paired with coniferous trees, which do not change leaf color in the same way that deciduous trees like maples do, for example. Evergreen conifers were networked into the imagistic web of autumnal poetics in landscapes washed of color as winter dormancy approaches. Let's have a look at another autumnal screen, and this one is by Tawara Yasuo Tatsu. Unlike the previous work, this one is unapologetically polychrome, deploying bright mineral pigments, including green and blue and red, on a gold ground. This time, our viewpoint is much more proximate. We're in fact so close that the canopy of the extravagantly curved tree at the right of the painting is out of view, though we have a clear view of its bridge-like roots and the autumn flowers and grasses that occupy the undergrowth. 5 trees of the same long-needled species are shown here, some displaying curvature, others by contrast growing straight. All share the dark bunches of needles and even darker lichen-covered trunks. The painting is titled, in English, Chinese Black Pines and Maples, or in Japanese, Maki kaede zubyoru. The maples portion, the kaede part of this, is more straightforward. We find its red maple leaves peeping out from among the dominant maki trees here and there, with one tree planted just inside the third panel, reaching leftwards as if trying to escape from the dark coniferous ground in which it finds itself outnumbered. A single tree growing out of the foreground in panel 5 seems to stop the rhythmic passage of a notional zigzagging path through the conifers, each of which touches the others in a complex needled network. Chinese black pine, however, is a common name, and it refers to the genus Pinus. And look as I might, I could not triangulate this painted pine with an actual pine and a translation of its name. So I turned to my colleagues at the Arboretum, and looking with them suggested that in fact, the long-needled tree is not a pine, but a podocarpus, perhaps Podocarpus macrophyllus, which is a member of a different family with common names that include Japanese yew, Buddhist pine, and fern pine or plum pine. The Japanese word maki is more capacious than the specific translation Chinese black pine, and may well better be translated as evergreens or simply conifers. This is rather important in that it is this word maki upon which this screen turns. Not only is it the dominant painted plant here, it is the trigger word for connection to its poetic community of fuller shared meaning. Although no poem is physically inscribed here, as in the previous screen, the preponderance of maki trees here brings to mind one of the best known of all autumnal dusk poems by the monk Jakuren. Jakuren here is dressed in white, sitting on the right-hand side. This poem can be translated: forlornness in itself holds no particular color to be perceived. Mountain stands of evergreen in the autumn dusk. Now, the poem is one of 3 poems known as the Three Dusks, or the Sanseki no Uta, which repainted classical autumnal poetics in the subdued hues of medieval poetics, inspired by Buddhist sensibilities and an aesthetics of impermanence, endowing them with new depth in the process. Jakuren's poem denies the classical association of autumn melancholy with colorful leaves, asserting that conifers are equally able to carry the association of forlornness, since the true colors of autumn are carried in the heart. Visual effects produced by words, the poem teaches, are all, in the end, illusory. In the center, we have Fujiwara no Teika, famed poet. His dusk poem has similarly been read as a manifesto for this change in sensibility in seasonal vocabulary, in which it is no longer necessary to see autumn colors in order to share autumnal sensibility. His poem goes, "Gazing out, I see no longer either blossoms or russet leaves. A hut by the bay in the autumn dusk." Teika's poem teaches that a simple contrast of evergreens visible to the eye with colorful foliage in the mind can suffice, and that in fact, even a hut by the bay can serve the same purpose, generating the desired sympathetic response of forlornness. There is a negation in these poems of the hallowed links between seasonal subjects and poetic sentiments that is replaced by an evolved aesthetic perspective and a rejection of beauty that appeals only to the senses. The three dusks were highly regarded in the Edo period, and Sotatsu's screen, produced over 400 years later, appears to participate in this dialogue. It presents the maki, Jakuren's new evergreen markers of autumn forlornness that can be felt without the need for the explicit invocation of sensuous red leaves as the dominant tone. Yet Sotatsu also adds a scattering of red maple leaves, highlighting the very contrast that Jakuren and Teika's poems defy, as if to illustrate not only the plants, but the poetic point itself. Now, there is another sense in which this screen is connected in a figurative arboreal network, and that is that it is one among a number of paintings which were copied by painters who sought to paint themselves into the loose lineage we today call Rimpa, by creatively copying the work of self-appropriated masters from whom they were often distant in time. In this case, Ogata Korin produced his own iteration of Sotatsu's screen, replicating and adapting from the sustaining mother tree to which he connects himself in this act of creative replication. If we look closely, we can see that his maple leaves are not pristine. They are mottled with black and decaying with the approach of winter. The choice of a gold ground and polychrome pigments also materializes the fundamental tension of the poetic principle with which the composition engages. The painting interconnects visual and verbal images cultivated in shared attention and poetic imagination so that they flourish in the ecological ground of paintings of non-human beings, in the often overlooked and underestimated genre of bird and flower painting. Now, if we take the analogy a little bit further and recall the network of communication across the mycorrhizal web between Douglas fir trees visualized by Suzanne Simard, we might place these screens in a pictopoetic shared network of secondary nature, sustained and cultivated by shared attention and imagination that could look something like this. Let's finish by taking a look at this screen of Autumn Maples by Tawara Yasori. In this painting, as you can see, we have exclusively maples in stands of 2s and 3s. Again, we see these combinations of elegantly curving and straight trunks, creating a sense of gentle, rhythmic movement, suggestive of a light wind. Our viewpoint is just outside the grove, and we are guided inwards by the careful positioning of the trees to form a notional path, leading into the undefined luminous distance of the gold ground. The sinuous branch of the foremost tree reaches down almost like an arboreal hand to usher us into this magical space. The trunks of the trees are modeled with variations in texture and tone, both native and epiphytic, modeled in dripped-in ink or tarashikomi, a trademark Rimpa technique. The leaves, by contrast, are painted in opaque mineral pigment and veined with gold. Like the magnolia fan, they are closely observed, but stylistically distant from the desiccated accuracy of a botanical sketch. Now, like Sotatsu's scream, there is no poem physically inscribed as its heartwood here. But the open lyrical space at the center of the composition seems to invite occupation by a specific poetic image as yet unidentified. Perhaps the screen was once a pair with a springtime image, blossoming trees, for example. The survival of a suggestively similar later monochrome screen depicting springtime paulownia trees and inscribed with 3 spring and summer poems certainly seems to indicate this as a playful possibility for its precursor. Establishing the interconnecting pathways between these paintings is work that remains to be done. But once again, here we do see play with autumnal color. Just a few inner leaves are depicted here, not in senescent red, but in mineral green. Why should this be? Well, my colleagues at the Arboretum tell me that in fact this is commonly observed with maples, where the outermost leaves exposed to the most light and temperature change first, and the inner, more sheltered leaves tend to lag behind. So perhaps this is Sori painting a Magnolia sieboldii. Or perhaps he may also be joining the conversation about the superfluousness, or otherwise, of a particular color to trigger autumnal poetic sensation. It could be read as both depiction of autumnal sentiment and as a commentary on the aesthetics of that depiction. Before we leave this painting, we should turn our attention not only to what we can see, but also to what we can't quite see. Now, at the extreme of the pictorial field, in the top left corner, just here, at the cusp of our vision, are the tiniest corners of leaves that are suspended, flickering at the very edge of our awareness. As the critic John Berger, in his book, Why Look at Animals, wrote, it can happen suddenly, unexpectedly, and most frequently in the half-light of glimpses that we catch sight of another visible order which intersects with ours and has nothing to do with it. These 2 tiny flickering leaf tips create the feeling that we are here seeing between 2 frames, as if we have come upon a part of the visible which wasn't destined for us, but rather for songbirds and insects, squirrels or deer, who are absent from the scene into which we have now entered. In that sense, the magical atmosphere conjured out of poetic and pictorial matter is a reminder of sorts that our customary visible order is not the only one. This luminous grove is a visualization of an interstitial place suffused with a sense of quiet expectancy. Its beauty invites us into a world where the ecology of perceptive attention and imagination co-produce a fertile environment for the persistence of both elements that are key to the cultivation of sound ground for the type of resilient hope out of which we may find the interconnected capacity to imagine anew and to act for change. It is often said that gardening is an act of optimism because you always plant for the future. And there are ways in which art history too, as it calls upon and across multiple disciplinary specialisms, is optimistic in its own particular and capacious nature, and in the ways it can fuel the resilience and vision required of this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your own perspective and that of your Harvard colleagues to bring new life and understanding of Japanese paintings and sculpture. Amy Poster comments that close looking has always been one of your strengths and contributions. The keen observation of nature is a given, but now you have encouraged us to seek out new practices. Many thanks. One question we have is, what inspired you to address this timely topic?
Oh, goodness. Well, there was quite a lot of serendipity involved in this. The programs that I spoke about with the Arnold Arboretum came out of a collaboration around the exhibition in 2020 of the Feinberg collection, an exhibition titled Painting Edo. And of course, this sort of coincided with the pandemic. But prior to the shutdown, I was very fortunate in that I visited the exhibition with my colleague from the Arboretum, Michael Dossman. And we actually got stuck on the screen that's currently in my background here, my Zoom background here. We got stuck here for about 40 minutes because he was so excited by this painting. Now, Michael is a specialist in trees and woody plants, and he's a biologist, not an art historian. But as soon as he saw this screen, he couldn't help himself. He was identifying the species that were depicted. And we're used to thinking about Rimpa painting as being sort of designed and decorative and, all these words that get sort of thrown about Rimpa painting. We're not used to thinking about it as botanically accurate. And stylistically speaking, it doesn't project itself as a botanically accurate mode of painting. But Michael's observations, which came from his expert point of view of plant morphology, meant that he could see things that art historians weren't noticing. He was noticing where the depiction of places where buds were swelling or where leaves had been lost, or other sort of biological features that mostly just passed art historians by. But they are there in these Rimpa paintings, these so-called decorative paintings. And so this kind of clash of viewpoints really fascinated both of us. And we took a tour through the museum looking at all of the plants in these paintings, and it just kind of snowballed from there. It was a moment of excitement, really, that sort of set this off, the bringing together of two different points of view in a museum setting around paintings that we were experiencing, in person. And we just wanted to translate that excitement to other people. And it turned out that other people did want to hear about this.
Well, with very good reason. Rachel, where can you go to find out more on this approach, this really interesting novel approach?
Well, if you'll forgive the self-advertising, we did post all of these, all the online events that we did together. They've been posted on the Arboretum's website and the museum's website. I think we could probably send participants a link after the webinar today if people want to follow along there. Doing reading, well, I myself did write an essay for the exhibition catalog. The exhibition catalog is called Painting Edo, and I wrote an essay about this topic in relation to the paintings of Sakai Hoitsu. So that would be a place you could find some more information about my approach to it. I think it's not been very widely picked up in this country. You might find more written about it in Japanese. There's a lot more emphasis on accurate identification of plants in paintings in Japanese art historical scholarship. That's because the language of plants is such a given in Japanese art historical work and also in poetic work. It's a given that a plant has a meaning. It has a symbolic meaning. It has a life. It has semantic force. Which is not quite the same approach that they tend to have in the West, and particularly the contemporary West, where plants well, this issue of plant blindness is very real, and the idea that plants might be ornamental rather than valued for this very long poetic preservation of their symbolic lives that I've been talking about in this webinar today tends to mean that people overlook them in other ways. So I think that it might be a pretty new approach.
I think you're right. And that dovetails into a question, which is how different is the Japanese perception of nature compared to other countries? So I think partially
what a great question. There's a really great book about this by the literature scholar Haruo Shirane at Columbia University. He wrote a book about this very question, because there's this very essentializing sort of point of view that often comes out when you talk about Japan and nature. The two things get linked together as if Japan has a very special way of dealing with nature. But in fact, I would argue that it's not so much dealing with actual physical nature, quote unquote nature, living plants and beings. It's this secondary nature in which plants and animals and insects and grasses are translated into poetic beings. They're written beings as much as they are living beings. And then when you get paintings too, you end up with this amazing triangulation in bird and flower painting, where you triangulate the living being with the written being with the pictured being. And there are amazing spaces in between those three things where you can really play And that's where this whole kind of magical world of bird and flower painting opens up. And that's what I was indicating when I was saying I think it's a very underestimated genre. It's complicated to trace those triangulations, and it might try the patience of some people. You literally get in the weeds with it sometimes, but it is what makes bird and flower painting so powerful, but also easy to dismiss. You can sort of layer a symbolic meaning on top of a beautiful plant and leave it at that, and that doesn't really take you anywhere. But I think what is different is this triangulation, and that might be what would be a better way to look at the so-called Japanese way of thinking about nature than just assuming it means wild living plants and animals.
Yeah. One question we have is from one of the attendees is there Japanese poetry that reinforces the idea of the leaf tips in the top left corner of the screen being an integral of the art, as opposed to merely indicating the continuity of the nature beyond the human view?
What a beautiful question. I hope so. And if anybody out there has found some, I would love to hear about it. I'm sure there is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation from Catherine Sugusheva, who said absolutely fascinating. Do you see a more in-depth publication on the subject in the future? So many interesting points are missed due to not understanding the quote hidden unquote language in plants of art.
Indeed, very much so. Yes, I am. This is something I'm working on. Yes, very much so.
That is just great. Tell us about what you're working on, perhaps a little preview.
Well, this was a little preview.
Okay. All right, so we will look forward to work more to come. David Haskell asked, could you comment on the boundaries between wild and domesticated and gardened in the trees depicted here, or perhaps this does not exist in these works?
Great question. Actually, I would love to know what David thinks about that, because he is far more expert on this than I. That is a wonderful question. I think that perhaps I could, if you'll forgive me, I might just dodge this slightly and say that I think there is a sense of both. You are, of course, sort of choreographing and gardening when you're putting these living creatures together in a painted environment. And these, I'm showing you these screens, they're unfolded here, they're flattened here. And of course, when they were viewed in the round, they're folded, so there's dimensionality to it. So that is something that I'm not really able to show you in a Zoom screen. So there is this sort of picking up on a sense of truth to nature, but it's obviously very, very choreographed. And I would say that the same goes for the sort of depiction of the leaves, like the leaves that we're looking at in this screen here, the red leaves here. There are aspects of very detailed observation, sort of where the leaves have fallen off, the little tips of the branches, the twigs, the leaf tips of the leaves themselves, the fact that they're veined in this way. All those things are observed, but and also there's sort of spots of decay as well going on these leaves too. But they're also painted in this very opaque, flat way, and all of the leaves are frontal. We're not getting different angles here. They're all frontal. So we've got this sort of patterning, the best view, the best side of the maple leaf, as it were. So we're not looking at a painting of life. And I think also these types of screens, they may have been a way of bringing a garden indoors, of bringing seasonality indoors. There is a wonderful screen that I would love to have the chance to look at with David one day in the Freya Sackler collection of trees that really feels as though it's been painted so that you can have this grove available to you at any moment. You don't need to plant your garden beyond your veranda. You can bring out these screens when you need that seasonally. So whether it's, I think there are aspects of the wild that have been cultivated in painting and brought inside, and we are in a way looking at painted gardens when we're dealing with these kinds of images.
Yeah, fascinating. have some comments and also a question from Cynthia Altman, who first notes, says, thank you for the optimistic bent at this time when it is so needed. And your sessions in the middle of the pandemic were a lifeline. So thank you for that. She also asks or notes that the shapes of the maple leaves strike her as very regular and specific. Was that at all? Was that noted at all in your discussions with the Arboretum? And the 5 seem so balanced.
Yeah, no, I don't think we got into that enough. That I would be interested to put that question to my colleagues there too. As I previously said, I'm sort of thinking about it as this frontal presentation of the leaves. It's very much a representation of a maple leaf, a patterned maple leaf, rather than individual leaves here. So I'm not sure quite how to respond to that. They are indeed extremely regular, but in a way that sort of, to me, hints at more semantic heft here, rather than trying to portray something, mimetically as it looks. I think we're dealing with a notional leaf, a written leaf, just as much as we are a real leaf here. And that might be one of the reasons that they're appearing all in the same angle, all at the same sort of vantage point too.
Yeah. We have one comment from William Friedman, who says, yay, Arnold Arboretum. Ned says hello, which is a little cryptic, but I thought I would read it anyway.
This is Professor Ned Friedman, who I mentioned in the talk, who we did the events with. It's wonderful that you've joined us, Ned. Thank you for being here.
Wow. Well, I think that's all for our open questions. Let's see, we have about 6 minutes to go. Are there any closing comments or thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
Oh my goodness, I think I've probably taken up more than my fair share of airtime today already. I think I've said what I wanted to say, but if there are any further questions, I'm of course happy to take them. I guess I would like to say I would encourage anybody who's in the area, in the Cambridge, Boston area, to visit both the Arboretum and the Harvard Art Museums. There's always Japanese painting on exhibition at the Harvard Art Museums, thanks to the generosity of Robert and Betsy Feinberg. We always have Japanese paintings out in our second floor Japanese paintings gallery there. And the Arboretum, doesn't matter when you go, there is always something new to see there. So if you haven't had the chance to visit, do so. It's a really magical place. And if you can get both in on the same day, even better.
Right, and you will be visiting the Arboretum during your upcoming course at Harvard.
Indeed, yes. We're going to be running a seminar next semester about wood and the ecology of Asian art, so trees and Japanese art, and we're going to be teaching much of that at the Arnold Arboretum.
Sounds wonderful. Well, it was a real treat, and again, you've really provided a wonderful new perspective, and I thank you so much for that. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar, a recording of which will be posted on the JASA website. We'll look forward to seeing you again in the new year and have already planned 2 events for January. The first is an in-person visit with scholars scheduled for January 9th at 2 p.m. And it will be at the Japan Society to view the current exhibition, Out of Bounds. And the second is a Zoom webinar on January 24th at 5 p.m. with Metropolitan Museum Curator Aaron Rio on the current rotation of the exhibition, Anxiety and Hope in Japanese Art. So thank you again, everyone, and wishing you a very happy New Year. Bye-bye.